What if I told you that a former slave not only escaped to freedom, but also became a Civil War hero and a congressman? Meet Robert Smalls, a man whose incredible story of bravery, resilience, and determination will leave you in awe. In a time of division and turmoil, it's important to remember the individuals who have fought for freedom, equality, and justice. Robert Smalls is one such person whose remarkable story is a testament to the human spirit. Born into slavery in South Carolina, Robert Smalls went on to achieve what many thought was impossible. He escaped enslavement, fought for his country, and became a leader in the fight for civil rights. In this documentary, we will explore the incredible life of Robert Smalls, a man who, against all odds, overcame adversity and made a lasting impact on American history. On 511 Prince Street, in Beaufort, South Carolina, on April 5, 1839, Robert Smalls was born. His mother, Lydia, grew up in the fields of the Sea Islands, taken from her own family at the tender age of 9. The identity of Smalls' father remains unclear, with some speculating it was his owner, John McKee, his son Henry, or the plantation manager, Patrick Smalls. Despite this ambiguity, the McKee family favored Robert over the other slave children, a fact that would worry his mother. Lydia feared that her son would grow to manhood without understanding the horrors of the institution of slavery. She arranged for him to witness slaves being punished at the whipping post in the fields. As recounted by historian W. Marvin Dulaney and Smalls' great-granddaughter Helen Bulwer Moore, the lesson at the whipping post had a profound impact on Robert Smalls. His defiance resulted in frequent incarcerations in the Beaufort jail. Fearing for her son's safety, Lydia asked John McKee to allow Robert to work in Charleston on rental. At the age of 12, Smalls was sent to Charleston by his mother's request to work as a laborer for $16 per week, with only $1 given to him and the rest paid to his enslaver. He started working on a hotel and later as a street lamplighter before finding his way to Charleston's docks and wharves due to his love for the sea. Smalls performed various jobs, including longshoreman, rigger, and sailmaker, until he worked his way up to the position of a wheelman, which is essentially a helmsman, despite enslaved people not being allowed to hold that title. Through his work, Smalls gained extensive knowledge of the Charleston Harbor. Few people knew the ins and outs of Charleston Harbor better than Robert Smalls. The planter became the site of Smalls' employment, as well as his romantic encounter with Hannah, a slave from the Kingman family, who worked at a Charleston hotel. When Smalls was 17 years old, he married Hannah Jones on December 24, 1856 in Charleston. Hannah, an enslaved hotel maid, was older than Smalls by 5 years and had 2 daughters from a previous relationship. Smalls obtained permission from their owners to cohabitate in an apartment. In February 1858, they welcomed their first child, Elizabeth Lydia Smalls, followed by a son named Robert Jr. 3 years later. Unfortunately, Robert Jr. passed away at the age of 2. Fully aware of the temporary nature of their arrangement, Smalls approached Hannah's owner with a request to purchase his family, but the steep price of $800 exceeded his resources, as he only had $100. In his search for a backup plan, Smalls found an ally in Captain Relier, who bore a striking resemblance to him. Smalls inquired with Captain Relier about the possibility of allowing the crew's families to visit before the officer's departure. This was a request that was occasionally granted, and upon hearing it, Captain Relier gave his approval on the condition that the families depart before curfew. Once the families arrived, the men shared their plans with them. To the Confederates, the Union ships blocking their harbors represented the North's tyranny over the South. However, for slaves such as Robert Smalls, these vessels symbolized the tantalizing prospect of liberty. Navy commanders had been instructed by Secretary Gideon Welles in Washington to receive runaway slaves as contraband since the previous September. Smalls recognized that while he could not afford to purchase his family's freedom, he could secure their liberation by sea. Therefore, he advised Hannah to be prepared to seize the opportunity for emancipation whenever it arose. And indeed, an opportunity presented itself. The year was 1861, and the United States was plunged into a civil war that would test the mettle of the nation. In Charleston, South Carolina, Robert Smalls was assigned to steer the CSS Planter, a Confederate military transport ship. His duties were to survey waterways, lay mines, and deliver troops and supplies. From his vantage point in Charleston Harbor, Smalls could see the Federal blockade ships 7 miles away. But instead of feeling resigned to his fate, Smalls began to plan an escape. He discussed his plan with all the enslaved people on the planter's crew, except for one whom he did not trust. On May 12, 1862, the planter traveled 10 miles southwest of Charleston to Coles Island. a Confederate post on the Stono River that was being dismantled. It was here that Smalls saw his opportunity. The ship was to pick up 4 large guns to transport to a fort in Charleston Harbor. When they returned to Charleston, the crew loaded 200 pounds of ammunition and 20 cords of firewood onto the planter. With everything in place, Smalls put his plan into action. Under the cover of darkness, he and the enslaved crew took control of the ship, commandeering it from the white officers and sailing out of the Charleston Harbor. With Smalls at the helm, they headed for the Federal blockade ships, flying a white bedsheet as a flag of surrender. The following morning, at around 3 a.m., the group made their daring escape. 3 of the crew members pretended to escort family members home, but instead circled around and hid aboard another docked steamer. Meanwhile, Smalls and 7 others boarded the planter and set out for the Union blockade ships. As the planter approached the Confederate forts and batteries, it belched out thick smoke and thundered with such noise that it was clear to Smalls that trying to slip by unnoticed would be a fool's errand. He knew that the ship had to appear as though it was on a routine mission, with its 3 white officers in command. Smalls realized that the only way to pull this off was to impersonate the captain himself, and he was determined to make it work. With the cloak of night to protect them, Smalls boldly took on the role of captain, hoping to fool anyone who might be watching from shore or the forts. To avoid detection, Smalls put on the captain's uniform and a straw hat similar to the captain's. He even mimicked the captain's manners on deck to fool Confederate onlookers from shore and the forts they passed. As they sailed past 5 Confederate harbor forts, Smalls gave the correct steam whistle signals at checkpoints to avoid suspicion. With nerves of steel, Smalls guided the planter past Fort Sumter, the site of the first shots fired in the Civil War, without incident. The ship made a stop at another wharf to pick up Smalls' wife and children and the families of other crew members. When they were close enough, Smalls ordered the white flag replaced with a makeshift Union flag that he had hoisted aboard. He then steered the planter towards the Union ships, signaling his intention to surrender and offering the ship and its valuable cargo as a prize of war. The Union sailors, astonished by what they were witnessing, boarded the planter and took Smalls and his crew into custody. Smalls' brave and daring escape had not only secured his freedom, but had also provided valuable intelligence to the Union Army. He provided valuable information to federal officers. They learned that there were only a few thousand Confederate troops left to protect the area, as most of them had been sent to fight in Tennessee and Virginia. Additionally, the fortifications at Coles Island were being abandoned and left unprotected. This intelligence enabled Union forces to capture Coles Island and its batteries without any resistance a week after Smalls' escape on May 20th. The Union then used the Stono Inlet as a base for the remaining 3 years of the war. Smalls' bravery and intelligence impressed the Union officers, including Admiral DuPont, who wrote to the Navy Secretary in Washington, praising Smalls' skills. He referred to him as the intelligent slave and pilot of the boat, who performed this bold feat so skillfully, and noted that Smalls was even more knowledgeable than other enslaved people who had previously come to their lines. Before the Civil War, Robert Smalls had dreamed of buying his family's freedom for $700, but he never had enough money to do so. However, his bravery would lead to a much larger reward. For his actions, Smalls and his crew were awarded half the proceeds from the appraisal of the planter, which amounted to $1,500 for Smalls personally. He used the money to purchase his former owner's house in Beaufort off the tax rolls following the war, although the later Naval Affairs Committee report suggested that his pay should have been substantially higher. The Confederates were already aware of his role in the escape and put a $4,000 bounty on his head. Despite the skepticism of some Confederates, there was no record of any white passengers aboard the planter the morning of May 13th, and Smalls and his crew had acted alone. Smalls became a hero in the North and personally lobbied Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to begin enlisting black soldiers. After President Lincoln acted a few months later, Smalls recruited 5,000 soldiers by himself. In October 1862, he returned to the planter as a pilot as part of Admiral DuPont's South Atlantic blockading squadron. On a fateful day in December 1863, Robert Smalls was piloting the planter under Captain James Nickerson on Folly Island Creek when Confederate batteries at Secessionville began firing. Chaos erupted as Nickerson fled the pilot's house for the coal bunker, leaving the ship vulnerable to enemy fire. However, Smalls remained calm and refused to surrender. He knew that as black crewmen, they might not be treated as prisoners of war and could be executed without trial. With quick thinking and courage, Smalls took command of the boat and piloted it to safety. This act of bravery did not go unnoticed. He was reportedly promoted to the rank of captain by Gilmore and made acting captain of the Planter. In May 1864, Smalls received an unofficial delegate position to the Republican National Convention in Baltimore. Later that spring, he piloted the Planter to Philadelphia for an overhaul. While there, he supported the Port Royal Experiment, a program that aimed to raise funds to support the education and development of formerly enslaved individuals. It was during this time that Smalls learned to read and write. Despite his bravery and accomplishments, racism still reared its ugly head. In 1864, while riding a streetcar in Philadelphia, Smalls was ordered to give up his seat to a white passenger. Rather than sit on the open overflow platform, Smalls chose to leave the car. This incident highlighted the need for change and was cited in the debate that led to the passing of a bill to integrate public transportation in Pennsylvania in 1867. After the Civil War ended, Smalls returned to his hometown of Beaufort with newfound freedom and independence. One of his first acts was to purchase the house of his former master, which had been seized by Union tax authorities. This act was a powerful symbol of his victory over slavery and oppression. His mother, Lydia, who had been freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, joined him in the house, and it became the center of the family's life. But Smalls did not stop there. He continued to fight for the rights of African Americans in the South. He used his new wealth to purchase a two-story building in Beaumont, which he turned into a school for black children. It was an important step in providing education for African Americans, who had long been denied the opportunity to learn. In addition to his work for education, Smalls showed compassion to his former master's wife, Jane McKee. Despite the fact that McKee had owned him and his family as slaves, Smalls allowed her to move back into her former home before she passed away. Throughout all of this, Smalls remained committed to personal growth and self-improvement. He spent 9 months learning how to read and write, an accomplishment that had been denied to him during his years of enslavement. He was determined to use his newfound knowledge and freedom to help others, and his actions in the years following the Civil War made a significant impact on the lives of many African Americans in the South. In 1866, Smalls went into business with Richard Howell Gleaves, a Philadelphia-based businessman. They opened a store to cater to the needs of freedmen, and Smalls hired a teacher to help him with his studies. That April, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, despite President Andrew Johnson's veto, followed by the 14th Amendment in 1868, which extended full citizenship to all Americans regardless of their race. Smalls invested a significant amount of money into the economic development of the Charleston-Beaufort region. Although with Joseph Rainey, Alonzo Ranzier, and others, Smalls formed the Enterprise Railroad in 1870, an 18-mile horse-drawn railway line that transported passengers and cargo between the Charleston wharves and inland depots. Except for one white director, the railroad's board was made up of only African Americans. Richard H. Kane served as its first president, and it was described as the most impressive commercial venture by members of Charleston's black elite. Smalls also helped publish a black-owned newspaper, the Beaufort Southern Standard, starting in 1872. In 1874, changes in the district gave Smalls a chance to run for the U.S. Congress in a South Carolina district where the majority of the population was black. Smalls' hometown of Beaufort had a population ratio of 7 African Americans to 1 white person. In the uneventful campaign, Smalls won the election with almost 80% of the vote, defeating independent nominee J.P.M. Epping, who ran on a reform platform opposing the radical Republican state government. In his freshman term, Smalls received a key appointment to the Agricultural Committee, an important position for his farming constituency, which boosted his efforts to prepare for the potentially formidable opposition to his re-election. Despite the Democratic majority, Smalls was very active and productive in his first term. He obtained appropriations to improve Port Royal Harbor for his coastal constituents, which passed with little debate due to a letter presented as evidence from the Secretary of War. Smalls also sought compensation from the federal government for its use of Charleston's military academy, the Citadel, since 1865, and other internal improvements. Smalls was open in defending his race and his party. In June 1876, he unsuccessfully tried to add an anti-discrimination amendment to any Army reorganization bill that would have integrated Army regiments and prevented race from affecting soldiers' placement. The following month, he addressed a bill to redeploy federal troops in the South to patrol the Texas-Mexican border. Smalls argued against transferring federal troops stationed in his home state, warning that private red shirt militias, which was South Carolina's version of the Ku Klux Klan, would wage war on the government and freedmen. Supporters of the troop transfer argued that the corrupt Republican government in South Carolina was responsible for the violence and that it was a state issue. However, Smalls disagreed, noting that the federal presence would help cut off that rotten part all around South Carolina so as to let the Corps stand. He argued that it was the rotten parts that were causing the problems and that they were getting along fine themselves. During his campaign in 1876, he was traveling across the state with Republican Governor Daniel Chamberlain when they stopped in Edgefield, South Carolina for a rally. But things quickly turned dangerous when Red Shirt leader and former Confederate General Matthew Butler stormed in and threatened Smalls' life. Luckily, they managed to escape unharmed. But a sympathetic observer couldn't help but compare Butler and his Red Shirts to a Revolutionary Army. To make matters worse, Smalls' opponent, George D. Tillman, came from a prominent Democratic family and made tensions even higher. The New York Times labeled him a Democratic tiger who was violent towards Republicans and had inflammatory language. Smalls didn't hold back either, describing Tillman as the personification of red shirt democracy and the archenemy of my race. Despite leading the militia to break up a strike in the middle of the campaign, Smalls narrowly defeated Tillman with just 52% of the votes. However, the Democratic Party still managed to sweep local elections in South Carolina. Fortunately, polling places were largely spared from the red shirt violence because Governor Chamberlain had requested federal troops to stand guard. But the drama wasn't over yet. Tillman contested the military presence, hoping that a Democratic Congress would rule in his favor. In the end, during the final session of the 44th Congress, Smalls defended himself by calling Election Day in South Carolina a carnival of bloodshed and violence. It was a tense time for Smalls and his supporters, but they managed to come out on top despite all the obstacles in their way. Smalls arrived in Washington for the 45th Congress in 1877, ready to begin his role on the Committee on the Militia and face Tillman's challenge to his election. Unfortunately, he never got to start his work. In July of that year, the Democratic South Carolina state government accused Smalls of accepting a $5,000 bribe while he chaired the printing committee in the state senate. Smalls went to Columbia to face trial on October 6, 1877. He was found guilty on November 26th and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Republican newspapers claimed that Democrats targeted Smalls because of his success as a black representative. After 3 days in jail, Smalls was released, pending his appeal to the state Supreme Court. He then returned to Washington to face Tillman's contested election challenge before the democratically controlled Committee on Elections. Although the committee ruled in Tillman's favor, the House never considered their findings before the end of the second session on June 20, 1878. As a result, Smalls retained his seat, which was a symbolic victory for House Republicans. However, his attention was divided between his criminal case and the defense of his seat, leaving him little time to legislate during the short third session. In the 1878 election, Smalls' chances were slim. Black politicians in South Carolina faced deadly threats from the white supremacist-controlled government. Sea Island observer Laura Town described the political climate as frightful, where men were shot at, hounded down, trapped, and intimidated in every possible way. Moreover, Smalls' unresolved conviction was used against him by his opponent, Tillman, who defeated him despite Smalls winning a majority of the black votes in the district. The small number of voters who braved the fierce intimidation were unable to prevent the Democratic sweep. In the end, Tillman took 71% of the votes, with Smalls receiving only 29%. After his 1877 conviction for accepting a bribe, Smalls was pardoned in 1879 by the Democratic governor, allowing him to return to politics. Smalls remained optimistic about Republican politics in South Carolina and was popular among the black population in Beaufort. In 1880, he decided to challenge Tillman for his seat, but faced challenges in rallying black voters due to their disenchantment with the local Republican corruption scandals and the disorganized and disgraced state party. Red shirt intimidation also complicated matters. Despite failing to defeat Tillman in the 1881 campaign, Smalls contested the election and won support from the Committee on Elections by testifying about voter intimidation. House Democrats tried to prevent him from taking the seat, but their plan failed, and he was seated with overwhelming support. Smalls returned to his committee appointments, but the short term left him with little time to legislate. Smalls was unsuccessful in his attempt to secure federal debt relief for South Carolinians, but he succeeded in passing a bill that would regulate the manufacture and sale of liquor in the District of Columbia, with an amendment guaranteeing the integration of eating facilities. He won an easy victory in the 1884 election and was appointed to the Committee on War Claims, but lost the nomination for the U.S. Senate. Smalls gave a passionate speech asking Congress to approve a pension for the widow of General David Hunter, which was ultimately vetoed by President Grover Cleveland. He also steered through a bill allowing for the redemption of school farmlands and submitted a resolution requesting relief funds after a flood in 1886. However, the House refused to appropriate funds, and Smalls failed in his bid to make Port Royal a coaling station for the U.S. Navy. In 1886, Smalls faced a challenge for re-election from Henry Thompson within his own party, who tried to exploit the growing competition between full and mixed-race persons. However, Thompson's radical position proved less of a threat to the nomination, but black voters were divided in the general election, with the darker delegation voting against Smalls. This division in the black vote made Smalls vulnerable to Democratic attack, and he lost to Democrat William Elliott, despite black disfranchisement being common. Smalls contested his loss, but the House, tired of handling the South's racial problems, declining to seat him with a vote of 142 to 127 in 1889. Smalls accepted his loss and had already stepped aside to allow a younger politician, Thomas Miller, to run for his seat in 1888. Robert Smalls and his first wife, Hannah Jones Smalls, had 3 children: Elizabeth Lydia, who married Samuel Jones Bamfield and had 9 children, Robert Jr., who died at age 2, and Sarah Voorhees, who married Dr. J. Williams but had no children. Before marrying Robert Smalls, Hannah Jones Smalls had 2 daughters, Charlotte Jones and Clara Jones. After his wife Hannah's passing on July 28, 1883, Robert Smalls married Annie E. Wigg on April 9, 1890. Annie was a school teacher from Charleston, and the couple had 1 son, William Robert Smalls, born in 1891. Unfortunately, Annie passed away on November 5, 1895. Robert Smalls passed away on February 23, 1915, at 75 due to malaria and diabetes. He was buried in his family's plot at the Tabernacle Baptist Church in downtown Beaufort. The monument in the churchyard bears the inscription of his 1895 statement to the South Carolina legislature. "My race needs no special defense, for the past history of them in this country proves them to be the equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life."